is give Beth a chance to just sort of give a brief overview of what the writing committee has been up to and how they got to this point and where this work sits in the process. And then be able to answer any questions you have or hear any feedback that you want to provide before putting your thoughts in the form. Beth, did I miss anything, or can I hand that right over to you then?
I think you can. I don't think we missed anything. I'm sure we'll find out if we missed anything, and that's what this is about. So it's good.
Fantastic. Well, then without further ado, I give you all Beth Ratway from AIR, working with OSSI on the technical writing committee for the DC Social Studies Standards.
All right, and Alex, can I share my screen?
Yes, hold on 1 second.
No worries. Well, it's nice to see everybody. I've heard a lot about you, and I have been toting your principles everywhere. It has been like just telling everybody about them. Your guiding principles are amazing. They're really going to push us to a really, really good place. New Mexico, I'm working in New Mexico right now as well, and they have a set of similar, not as expansive, but similar guiding principles. So I feel like social studies is going in the right direction, and I'm really excited about this work. Let me share my screen. There we go. Why can't I find how to share my screen on here? I'm on here all the time. Oh, there it is. It's a big green button that's always the same spot. Oh, welcome to my world. So welcome. What we wanted to use this time for, and honor your time, is for you really to ask me questions. But we decided I wanted to give you just a little bit of background, because I probably didn't do as much background because I wanted to kind of just get you to the work in the recorded session. Thank you. If you haven't listened to it, be sure to listen to it. And hopefully this can give you a summary, a pre-summary if you haven't. But if you have, thank you, and let me know if you have questions. Our objective for this review is to give feedback on the structural components that will best reflect the guiding principles and be most useful for educators. So let me tell you about the method to my madness in terms of where we're at. This is it right here. This is everything we talk about. Anything we do, everything we do is guided by your work and these principles. And it's really going to be the tool that we come back to every time. I always ask them as it relates back to guiding principles. And it's very exciting and has really enriched the discussions as we move the work forward. So what I did was I looked at your guiding principles and tried to find some examples in either national documents and state documents, in international documents that could have some bright spots that connect back to your guiding principles. Your guiding principles really push practice, which is what we need. So there's not as like a clear cut, hey, everybody, you know, this state has a great example of this, but there are some good nuggets out there. Just for your input and background a little bit on my work, I think I'm at 14 different states that I've supported and facilitated social studies standards review to date. Right now I'm in South Dakota, DC, New Mexico, and the Virgin Islands just on social studies. And then Kentucky and Pennsylvania, I'm doing science. That's a whole nother conversation. But social studies is my sweet spot. I was a high school teacher for 15 years. I was a social studies person at the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction for 5 years. And now the last 11 years have really been working on the concept of standards and watching and learning about what could be best practices, and also pushing practice in that area, really focusing on, we need to bring educators to the table. This is who needs to do it. You can't have another outside organization write it for you. We need to empower them to write them. So that's been my big push. And so that's where I'm learning. I'm watching and learning from each of the different states and territories on what works, what doesn't work, and trying to make it contextualized to the work. You made it easy for me, and I appreciate that, because you've made the guiding principles. It's a messy process, isn't it? Really getting down and really getting at those core ideas that should guide the work. And I applaud you in terms of this. And so we must use these in terms of reflecting for everything. So the first part of the conversation in terms of standards work most often is drafting a structure or architecture for the standards that are grounded in vision, mission, and guiding principles. Again, I say that you did a lot of the footwork ahead of time, and I appreciate that, and it makes this conversation go a little bit more smoothly with the writing team. And so what I try to do is look at the guiding principles, vision and mission for wherever I'm working. It's all by that organization or that state or district and so on. And so I make a chart of all the guiding principles that are there and then try to find those resources. And so you're going to see a list of the resources that I had the writing team committee look at. And they are correlated. I didn't put the chart where they're correlated, but they give little snippets that come back to reflecting what your guiding principles are. Usually what I'm seeing in most states right now is the structure. These are the 4 key structural components of a set of standards. Strands, which most often in social studies have been the history, civics, economics, geography. Sometimes there's behavioral sciences in there and other components. So we're talking this structure that you're reflecting on also has an ethnic multicultural studies strand in addition to the 4 social studies strands. And then there's cross-cutting concepts. I see it in some states. I don't see it in other states. The idea of cross-cutting concepts are used in multiple ways in standards. One is you have it in the introduction. These are, the heart of that go across disciplines that are social studies specific per se, and that we're going to integrate through the standards. Another way is that if you've seen the next generation science standards, it's part of the standards document. You have the standard, and then you have these cross-cutting concepts underneath there, and then you have connections to other content areas and so on. So that's where that idea comes from. Some of the cross-cutting concepts come directly from your guiding principles. Some of the cross-cutting concepts that I sent to you come from other state documents, come from national documents, come from C3, come from NCSS. So it's just a start of things to think about. The writing committee looked at all of these components and gave feedback, and we're adjusting that, and we're also going to use your feedback based on this, and we meet with them on Wednesday to take another stab at kind of what structure makes the most sense for DC. And then the 2 kind of big components are core ideas. So most states right now organize their social studies standards if they've redone them in the last 5 years around these core ideas, or if you've seen the ELA standards, anchor standards. So you have the core ideas of history, the core ideas of economics, the core ideas of civics, the core ideas of geography, and with this sense, maybe the core ideas of ethnic multicultural studies. So those are trying to get at what is the heart of the discipline that we need to look at. It's more discipline specific core ideas than it is kind of those big picture cross-cutting concepts. So that's the other component. And then skills. And all of these are reflected in your guiding principles. And in the recorded PowerPoint, I show you where each of these where your guiding principles somewhat asks for these structural components. So it's really correlated in the recorded PowerPoint. Skills. You see skills in multiple ways in social studies standards currently. And in your own current social studies standards, you have a grade banded set of skills, a little bit disciplinary, a little bit inquiry. Some states have moved to grade by grade skills standards, really focusing on the inquiry component. Some states have gone to grade banded inquiry skills based. And then some folks have done an integrative approach. And so that means that if you've read standards, which I'm sure you have multiple times, there's that STEM language. All students should be able to, and then you usually use like a verb, a Norm Webb from the Webb's Depth of Knowledge, or a Bloom verb. Well, instead of going in that direction, we're making, for other states, we've made skills STEM language charts where you have all these different kind of stems that you could put in front of the content that they're grappling with and combine it with a skill. Or a set of skills that does not lock in the teacher to doing a specific strategy. It just shows they should be analyzing a primary source maybe with this content. Utah does that, Nebraska did it, New Jersey does it, and New Mexico's going to do it. So that's going to be a question in your survey after you watch the video, if you haven't yet, is what are your thoughts? What do you think most gets at appropriately your guiding principles? Is it, in combining the skills, having a set of skills by themselves, having a grade banded set of skills? It's a question to grapple with. And I give you some examples in the recorded PowerPoint. Just so you know why these came to be, and it's usually easier for someone to react to a structural document than it is to kind of build from scratch. I've found in the past that it's nice to like look at those guiding principles and put components together so people can move things around and try to manage it. The writing committee had a really good conversation about it, and I'm interested to get your feedback on the work as well. But what it does is it tries to, my focus in terms of any standards work is that we have this great writing team, right? And they have that experience. That's why they're here. We have all of you, which bring your experience and expertise and are going to be critical friends along the entire process, and have grounded our work. And your work, the guiding principles, are also grounded in research, some national trends. And so this says New Mexico, should say DC. I grabbed the slide today, sorry. But what I always do, sorry about that, but what I always do is make sure that all of these components help us make a decision, and we're not just grounding it on my classroom expertise or my building expertise or what I know or one piece of seminal research. We tried to do it in a blend. And what we did with the writing team so far is have them look at all these different things and try to figure out like what makes sense for the students of DC, across all contexts in DC. And so just a quick picture. These are, and I can send you if you want me to, Jessica, you just let me know. This is a list of the initial documents they looked at. We jigsawed them. They have access to all of them. So they looked at the Kentucky standards. They are ones who have core ideas, and then they have skills by grade and then content in between by grade, and that's an inquiry approach. Hawaii, which is a different look of standards because they're a state and a district. So they can structure their standards a little differently. So we worked on that and talked about sample context and content and these different, so there's some post pieces there. Nevada has some good cultural standards that they've integrated with their social studies standards, Washington as well. C3 framework, I have on here twice. It's been a day. And then Nebraska, which just did theirs, and they tried to do a concerted effort to have a greater perspective in their standards in terms of who is in their standards, who's represented. Alaska, because they have a different type of structure to look at. They also have a cultural piece and a native piece that might be useful to look at when we're giving choice voice when we're writing the standards. The native knowledge 360, which gives some good kind of language about some components, teaching hard history. The social justice standards really can help us unpack that ethnic studies, multicultural kind of component. If you haven't seen them, the British Columbia Indigenous Knowledge and Perspectives is pretty cool. It talks about implicit knowledge and explicit knowledge and has some really kind of interesting language and pretty powerful. Indiana Ethnic Studies Standards is one of the only states that has a set of ethnic studies standards. And so we looked at those a little bit to see if there's anything that could help us unpack some of the work as we move forward. Asia Society has a really good global perspective of standards around global literacy, global competencies. NCSS, obviously. And then a new roadmap came out called the Educating for American Democracy, literally while we were probably in a meeting. And it has some interesting perspectives and language, and it marries civics and history. And it's a roadmap from iCivics, NCSS, and a large plethora of big organizations that came together to build this roadmap. So this is a start of the things that they looked at, in addition to the current DC standards. So this is kind of where those structural components came from. The Great Lakes criteria I didn't mention, which some of you might be really interested in. It's the criteria. They're like, you can look at curriculum and standards and look at it for bias, stereotyping, cultural competency, and it's all grounded in research, like James Banks, Gloria Ladson Billings, and it has all these statements about what you should look for in standards and curriculum. So we'll be using that along the way, but also thinking about that language as we write to be more proactive than reactive in terms of let's start from a good beginning. Those are the guiding principles. So the next steps you got in your email, you have a video of me explaining all of the different components a little bit more in depth. And then the PowerPoint with that is also there. And then what we're asking you to do, hopefully, please, by the end of the day tomorrow, even the evening, that's fine. I understand everybody's busy. You just got off of break and everything's going on. But we're meeting with the team on Wednesday afternoon. So I really want to kind of look at the data, do an initial dive, and then go in with them so that we can make more decisions about the architecture based on your feedback. That's what I have in a nutshell. If you've gotten a chance to look at it, if you haven't, what are things that come to mind? What are questions? A lot, I know.
I have a question. Sorry, I don't know if we're stacking in a certain way.
No, go ahead, Laura. I was going to say, if folks want to raise their hand in the chat or just chime in, that'd be great.
So, and this is, I'm obviously not an expert on like standards in a big picture. I'm thinking from my own personal experience teaching world history, the modern variety, and the whole depth versus breadth question is a huge one, obviously, when trying to cover so much. At the same time, I have a lot of concerns about reducing the standards because there are so many good things in there that it's like, if you take them, like you're making choices, right? When you take them away. Now I'm also making choices because I can't cover everything.
Right.
So it's not like it's perfect the way it is, but I guess, how are you looking at kind of balancing the whole, especially for some of these survey courses, the not avoiding the narrowing of the curriculum too narrow, but also trying to keep it from being so broad that it's just not possible. And then people just narrow it by default, which then also is no good.
Which is the nature of the beast of social studies and the biggest essential question we could ever have around social studies. Part of it,
yeah, I was just wondering like how you're approaching it. I know there's not like an answer, but
no, but I feel like our movement in terms of once the C3 came out, right, and you had, or like even the Common Core when they had those anchor standards, that grounds us in like this is it. These are the big ideas. And that's what's important. Like this is social studies. These really, and if you're studying world history, we need to make sure that we are staying true and really helping kids grapple with these big ideas rather than the minutia of some of the things. But so it does give some choice, but it also helps guide the writing team in making decisions as well as either beefing up or narrowing down the curriculum. A lot of times when they start writing, I will have in their packets, their virtual packets, they'll have like AP guidelines. They'll have they'll have a lot of different like the national frameworks, like the world history and national history frameworks, and looking at some things where they can see what other folks have chosen in terms of importance. So they're not making it on their own. They're also using their experience as well. But I feel like those core concepts help narrow yet go deeper as well in the structural components of the standards. What we've also found helpful, and it's been done a little differently, is to give that content and concepts, like suggested content and concepts per standard. So it helps kind of narrow it in, but says it's suggested, so you can go direction you want to, but it also helps people kind of hook on to what those big things should be as they're unpacking those standards. So those are two ways that I've seen been helpful, and I've heard from teachers that they're helpful in terms of standards that have been implemented recently.
And just, sorry, as a quick follow-up, like, how are we making sure that it's not driven by Europe? Because that's also
trust me on that one.
The AP obviously had a huge blow up because of the way they narrowed it,
Yep.
and it became a Europe class. Like, how do we avoid that?
That was fully apparent to me when I looked at your scope and sequence and your standards, and it's the first thing that I said. It's the first thing that I say to most actually districts and or states is this is really Euro. Like, and when I was teaching, it was the same, but we pushed back because I'm a Latin American studies specialist. So naturally I kind of push back a little bit, but trust me on that one, we're going to push that. And we haven't gotten to that conversation yet, but I'm going to be showing them different examples of how to think a little bit more broadly about that. It's not that they aren't thinking that way, and the guiding principles push us in that direction. So that's one thing to ground it in. And I'm actually really excited about that.
I could follow up on Laura too, just as a point of sort of perspective too. Like my hope is that the standards teach through Black history and not just about Black history too. So making sure that it isn't just about naming people or naming events, but actually like changing the documents that we're teaching school skills through, changing sort of those perspectives so that it isn't siloed, if that makes sense.
Understood. Part of that, so that's a twofold, and I'm not trying to kind of put it in two different directions, but one, it's how we word the standards has to be different, and what language we use, but it also, that's a key thing in implementation, right? So we don't put the documents and so on usually in the standards documents, but that is an implementation piece, and we're capturing that along the way. Like what, because they're teachers, so they're always talking about implementation. It is what it is. And so I have a page where we're keeping resources and ideas and things to support implementation to make sure that it's pushing it in a different way. But the other, going back to that, it is the language of the standards. That's how, I mean, we have to be able to try to write standards that force practice to change, and force people, for lack of a better word, to use different resources and so on. Like you can't use the same resource to get at the standard that you have in the past. So that's the kind of thing, that's how we talk about those pieces.
Their thoughts, questions, reflections, wondering. Sally?
Yeah, I think I'll follow up also from my perspective. I'm not a standards expert. My eyes get crossed, just sort of looking at all the concepts. But I am interested in sort of the end result. I'm not a classroom teacher, but I guess I can say I represent those people on the outside, the partner community that can help with curriculum, that can help with experiences. And my interest is in many things, but mostly in this context, I've been talking about global education, the global perspectives piece. I'm glad that Asia Society you've been looking at that. So in looking at the documents, I want to be sure that global education and global content and global skills are not balkanized, also are not put aside, that we are looking at everything through a global lens, pre-K through 12. And the other thing that I noticed, and maybe you could talk a little bit about the ethnic multicultural strand or proposed strand. My initial reaction was to be a little concerned about that being separate. And so could you talk a little bit about the thinking, and on the global thing is, how do we ensure that this content gets integrated throughout, that we're really not doing it the old way where we do Europe and then we'll do a unit on Africa, but that it's about the connections, and that our history is, we see our history in an international context and connected with the rest of the world.
That's a great question for both of them. One, so first for the global connections, the what I've seen is this core idea space allows for that to happen. So if you have, the core ideas of global interconnections in geography, there's global economy under economics, if we can have a global component under each one way, right? So that the core ideas then are mapped out at every grade. So students should have opportunities to engage in those core ideas, at least most of them, depending on the grade level, multiple times throughout a year, rather than just having a global studies course maybe at some point, where, and again, it's how we write those standards, but then it's mapped out. And then it's the guidelines then that the standards writers use. So they're always thinking about global perspective because it is in the core ideas multiple times, and they have to use those core ideas to write the standards or move around or adjust standards. So that way, the way it's written is then it's combined. It's not like you do geography here, history here, or economics here. It's one example that they're going to look at. It's like, here's a topic that they want students in 6th grade to engage in, and here's a set of standards. The topic is interdependence. So here are some civic standards, here are some geography standards, here are some economic standards to help folks understand and help students unpack those concepts. So we're finding that the core ideas, along with maybe some more structural components of the document, maybe putting up themes like Hawaii does, helps ensure that global studies plays a role throughout. It also needs to play a role in the sample content and concepts. The more it's in there and the more it's prevalent in there, the more it's going to be taught. But I would say that if we ground it more in the standards, it's a better chance for it to be taught than to be in kind of some supplementary pieces of it. The ethnic studies, the ethnic multicultural studies component would be both, right? So with the ethnic studies component, the way it is, I mean, those aren't the be all end all. That's what I'm waiting for all of your feedback on. It's some examples from some good documents. I mean, the Indiana document is good. I mean, it's new, but it's not new, right? Like this concept of how to really unpack it and where. And I'm seeing the big trend right now is to come up with an ethnic studies course. That is not the level of work that we're at. We're at standards. But in order for an ethnic studies course to happen, we need to have standards. So having multiple core ideas under standards and having that whole section ensures that students are engaging in those practices one way or another in that content the whole time. And it will be connected. It'll be interrelated to the geography, history, economics. It's just, if we frame it this way, I've seen that way it ensures that those opportunities are there for students. Also, in however we're gonna like tag some of the ideas that are in history, geography, if we decide to separate it out that way, or however we write the standards, that ethnic studies lens needs to be there while we write it. And that's actually where that the Great Lakes Equity Center, their tool will be in front of writers at all times, and it'll be a reflective tool for them to make sure all perspectives are there, that, you know, that as they're writing all of the standards, no matter where it is, that they are having that as a lens. So I would say maybe look at that a little bit and see if you think that's going to help, but it is a tool that will have, you know, they use it right now and I have a meeting with them tomorrow actually to help me think about it. But as you know, for somebody that's written curriculum and standards already to then look at it, I want it there at the table while they're writing, so it does ensure that multiple perspectives of choice, voice, all the different components that you were putting in your guiding principles are there.
Yeah, so that sounds good. And I guess I would say that back to the global, I want that same lens applied. And that's what I'm concerned about. There's so many different things. Obviously, it's hard to confuse everything with everything.
Mm-hmm.
But I have seen, I mean, global education is, as with so many other things, is at a transition point. It's not an add-on. It's just a way to kind of view everything that the students are doing. And if the writers are not thinking that way, then I could see it's easy to just sort of have it as separate, you know, separate units, separate standards.
Yep.
And that's what I have been working against. And I know Asia Society sort of promotes the same idea. So, okay, thank you.
Thank you. I could sit and talk with you all day. Yes, Scott.
Thanks, Beth. So I have a question about the cross-cutting concepts, as that's something that we don't currently have in the DC social studies standards. So I want to make sure I understand what's being proposed here. So I'm looking at this, one of the materials you've shared, the slide deck. I haven't watched the video yet, but where it has the examples of cross-cutting concepts, things like power, identity, culture, perspectives, etc. I'm wondering how those would be used in the writing of the standards, and then how those would show up in the document. And the question behind my question is, sometimes I think it can be overwhelming when you're looking at too many different things within a standards document. And I know sometimes when I look at other states ones, I'm like, it's too much. I can't think about this. And so I like the ideas of those concepts that are being proposed there, or those kinds of things. But I'm also worried about it being overly complicated in the way that the standards look, in a way that might make it harder for teachers to make sense of, or for informing the curriculum. So I wonder if you could speak to that a little bit.
Agreed. So it's a suggestion because I wanted to put it there because I wanted to be reflective of your guiding principles one way or another. And so many of the key concepts in your guiding principles are cross-cutting. So I wanted a space for them and for us to think about it. And this is one way, and it's reflective, as I said, of the NGSS. But I see NGSS, and I look at it and I feel like it's ADHD and page and I have no idea where to go. And so it gets complicated for me. You know, it's like I don't, and as a teacher, I mean, and I've worked with teachers all the time on implementing that. So I wanted to present it to folks to see. In New Jersey, what we did was we had this set of cross-cutting concepts, and we worked on creating clear definitions of them, and the writers had them next to them as they were writing. And so that's how we did it. And then you know, some implementing activities that we're doing now with teachers is, oh, you see the front matter, which nobody ever reads, but here's the front matter. These are the cross-cutting concepts that we use to write the standards. And then we have teachers like highlight where they are as they're unpacking their grade level set of standards. And we're like, these are the, you know, this is the be all end all, like the purpose of social studies is right here. But so I feel like that made it less complicated. One conversation, I'll be honest, that I heard in the your writing team meeting was, do we just use the cross-cutting concepts as our core ideas? And that's it. Like, we don't strand it, we don't do anything. So that's a bubbling conversation. I don't know how many people said that. I have to go back and look at all the data and before we meet on Wednesday. That was one thing that they were thinking about. Not sure. I mean, I haven't seen it done that way before, and not sure how comfortable that would be to push into practice, but that's a conversation that was started at our last meeting. So just know that kind of came up. But I want to talk, on Wednesday, we're going to talk through what you all say, what their group reflection was, because they individually did it as well. So we're going to look at the data across and make some decisions. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know if we need it in the actual end structure, but I think it's really critical, at least in the writing, if not in the end structure. But I feel like that would be a cool tool for implementation if you have it in the front matter for folks like you that are doing implementation. You're like, hey, this is it. This is social studies. This is what we're trying to do. And that's what these standards are grounded in. Does that help?
Yeah, that's helpful. And actually, I like the way you described it for what was with New Jersey, like using it, because that's how I could see it being really useful to have those next to the writers as they're writing specific standards, so that you know that concepts of justice and conflict are making their way in there. But yeah, if it's sort of in the narrative portion at the beginning of the standards, hopefully someone will read that eventually. But you know, yeah, I agree.
Good job.
They're going to flip more to those, you know, grade level specific ones, I suspect.
Yep.
Thanks for that, Beth.
Yeah, thank you.
Fidal's up next.
Hi, Fidal. I saw you somewhere. Where are you on my screen? Oh, there you are.
Yeah, I'm here. Should be popping up now.
There you are.
There. Hey there, Beth. Thank you for coming. And thank you for your work here. I think this is pretty interesting to see like how all this work we put into the guiding principles is like very much coalescing into something real. And I'm very excited to see what comes of it. My question was around sort of support for vertical collaboration.
Mm-hmm.
I think often with a child's trajectory through social studies, through K-12, right, it's often very disjointed. And I think there's two sources for that disjointment. I think there's one, just generally what's happening in schools, like we don't do enough to support and encourage vertical collaboration across social studies teachers and social studies teams. But on the other hand, like if you actually look at the standards, I don't think they're really particularly helpful for promoting vertical collaboration in and of themselves. I think the skills are kind of build on each other, not a ton, not even with the skills, it's not great. But when you get into the history content, it's not intuitive about like how this is building upon year to year to year to year. And I'm wondering like how much is supporting vertical collaboration part of you guys' thought process, and like what are you doing when you're pushing there? Like for instance, like when I was watching the video and you were looking at the different ways of presenting the skills, like I was trying to think about like, okay, which way of structuring this would make it easier for a team of K-5 people who are supporting social studies for it to be very clear how they're building on each other's work each year, right? Even if something happens and a student goes from one school to another in DC, right? Like how likely is it that like they'll be on this trajectory that makes sense and is intuitive and like will build upon what they did the year before?
Thank you. It's a great question. So there's a couple different ways. One, going back to those core ideas, we've found, I mean, that's why I started standards conversation around core ideas, is because I'm finding that that leads to vertical articulation. Like everybody's writing along these same 20 ideas, right? So they're always thinking about these, whatever, 25, whatever ideas throughout. And so we go back and forth where everybody's using the same frame. That's why this architecture is so important from the beginning, because it grounds it in that vertical conversation. Because if everybody's going towards the same purpose, these same kind of core ideas and practices, and they're using that as a frame to write, then that allows for alignment. Because if everybody's talking about the concept of civic identity in first grade, second grade, third grade, fourth grade, it may be under like a different context, but it would still be the concept of civic identity all the way through. So, I mean, my goal as a social studies person, if they walked out, if our seniors walked out understanding in depth those 25 core ideas, I would be the happiest person on earth. And so that's kind of where we look at one way to do vertical. The other thing, and I emphasize this all the time because I know the reality is you can barely get kindergarten teachers together, much less kindergarten, first, second, third grade, and much less talking about social studies. So the piece there is we make sure that the standards writers are doing that. So they're going to work in small groups. Then we're going to bring them back together and say, hey, what you doing? How does that correlate? And really kind of have those conversations all the time. So we work in small teams, then we come together. Then we work in small teams, then we come together. So we consistently kind of keep going back and keep mapping it back. It'll keep being mapped back, those conversations, to your guiding principles. And if you guys choose the core ideas. So we'll always be going back, like, how are you unpacking that? Oh, well, that doesn't correlate to how we're unpacking that. Maybe we need to think about or talk about it at the same time. So those are two ways that we're looking at vertical as we go. I think it's really critical because let's be honest, we're not going to change that right now in terms of getting people together to talk about social studies, unless, I don't know, something big happens. But if we can build a document that allows for that to happen, whether they can get together or not, that's what we try to do.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Beth, I appreciate you continuing to call out, like, what is the work of the standards versus what is the work that will come after in the rollout, in the professional development, in the conversations about resources and connection between social studies teachers. That's going to be important to all this. So thank you for continuing to emphasize that, because we talked about that in the guiding principles, but like it's helpful to be reminded and have it reiterated, like the standards can't do all the work.
No, and I would suggest, this is just off the top of my head, I would suggest, and we're trying to capture as much as we can. I would suggest that you plan for that as a conversation with y'all within the next year, that you all kind of start talking about unpacking what implementation looks like. I do a lot of implementation mapping. So it's like a 3 to 5 year plan, and you focus on policy, curriculum, professional development, instruction, assessments, alignments, and you kind of unpack what's your role, what's the districts and the charter school role, what's the classroom role, and then it just kind of correlates again, kind of like we were talking about vertical alignment. It's systematic alignment that you're all like year one, you don't have to go full implementation. Please don't. Just read the standards and understand them and try to really make sense of them for yourself before you kind of hit the ground running. And how can we facilitate PLCs that do that? And what are some protocol? And that's it. And then year two, and so on and so forth. So that is a good discussion for you, so you can continue to support Ase in that, and then that there, Scott's team would be talking about that as well. I know he's already thinking about professional development and those types of things. So I think it's really important in terms of that. As I try to stop, I don't stop. This is why I have a separate document, because again, they're teachers. We need to capture in flight what they're thinking about in terms of practice over here, but we also need to move on and really think about the standards. So we always try to balance those two conversations at the same time, but really get them focused on the standards writing, because it's a short period of time to write standards, and implementation is a long period of time, and I'd never want to lose what they're talking about while they're building it.
Any other questions, comments, thoughts that you want to make sure we get to today?
To the point of implementation, I don't know if this is a set thing, just obviously until things, until standards are finalized and approved and all that. but I guess this is maybe for Jessica or Beth or both. But do we have an idea of when the intended implementation of the new standards would begin? So I guess the question being, is this something that if all goes according to plan, would they start to be used in that whatever that broad used way is for the 22-23 school year? Is there a gap in between, or just kind of curious of where we're thinking right now?
Yeah, so Scott, I can share what we built into the original timeline, which at this point we're still operating on, and we'll keep everyone posted if anything has to change. But the goal is that the writing committee will be done with its work and able to bring the board something to consider by the end of the calendar year 2021. The board will work to vote on that in the first quarter of 2022, making sure that there's a set of standards that OSSI can begin to roll out from the state level during the summer so that they're well in advance of the fall of 2022, 2023, right? So ideally we'd vote on these standards in March of 2022, which gives a few more months before summer shows up, and then professional development over the summer would be geared towards the rollout, and we'd start in fall 2022. I feel even better about that timeline, hearing Beth's description of what year one rollout looks like, because year one rollout then is not like we're all Olympic level implementers.
You will have them, they will be there, but
yeah, but these guys all know that I'm a weirdo triathlete, so we're not headed to Ironman in year one. We're practicing the sequence of doing these three things in concert with one another. So I think that's the timeline we agreed on with OSSI, and that's the timeline we're still shooting for.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. That's just helpful for trying to think at the district level. Then how are we planning for development of curriculum and assessments and professional development and everything else that goes with it? So
yeah,
thanks.
I'm also really heartened, Beth, to hear you talk about the next level moving into PLCs to implement and to support this sort of implementation, because I think one of the beautiful things about this process so far is that we have had such collaboration from teachers in both sectors, from curriculum folks in both sectors, from a variety of schools and LEAs, from museums, from universities. It would be nice to keep that theme going with the rollout so that PLCs were not like DCPS PLCs and charter individual LEA PLCs, but rather ninth grade world history PLC, all y'all come,
right?
Kind of thing, so that we're getting it from across the LEAs across the city.
Yeah, we're going to start doing a little bit. They already started talking. We haven't even started writing standards in New Mexico, but they've already started talking about we may build out micro-credential courses that are PLCs where people across anywhere, any districts could take them together in there. And that's a similar thing that you all could think about doing. Here, this is inquiry. And how do we unpack that together as a bunch of ninth grade teachers across different venues? How do we get the museum folks into this when we're talking about this topic? So there's different ways to think about it. I know in Kentucky we did online PD modules that led to some of their PLCs and those types of things. So there's lots of options that we can chat about. I can share.
Yeah, I've tried not to be super secretive about the fact that I have ulterior motives here with we talk a big game about collaboration across schools and across sectors. But it's easier when we define discrete lines of work to do it on. And social studies teachers are just amazing. So I trust that they'll be a really good group to build this work with.
And the writing team people are going to be your advocates, right? So the folks that are in there are working together now. They will be working together for, they'll get to know each other really well and become friends. And so those are going to be your biggest advocates for doing that, because they are working, they're just the example of that, which you'll see.
And 5 of them are part of the SISAC as well.
Right.
So we have that nice cross group. I don't want to dominate any more time. So if there's more questions, let's make sure we get those on the table. If not, we can return time so people can use the extra minutes to fill out their form.
Hi, Sarah. I see you over there.
Okay. Well, seeing none, if folks do have questions and they're just still pondering it, hang out. But otherwise, thanks for coming. Thanks for the good presentation, Beth. Thanks for the great questions. I got down a couple notes here to share with our board as well. And thank you for filling out your form by end of day tomorrow so that we can make sure that Beth and her team have that information in hand and can share it with the writing team, which meets at 4 p.m. on Wednesday. So please know the timeline is not sort of arbitrary. It's driven so that we can get the feedback back to your peers and keep the train moving on time.
And then we will get something back to you to look at as well once we have those conversations on Wednesday.
Awesome. And I'm going to try, Beth, to pop in for the first hour of that meeting before our state board meeting. My life is just spent with my friends here on Zoom, as I know all of your lives are. So, all my Zoom friends. Great. Thanks all. No need to stick around unless you've got more questions, but if you do, we'll hang out here for another minute or two. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Beth,
Yeah.
I did want to say, because I may be imagining it, maybe it was in the video you talked about connections with DC, that you were, that sort of that I thought I read that there were, you were already looking at where the connections were to what is in DC. Am I doing that, or?
I mean the DC standards?
Not the DC standards, but integrating that. Maybe I'm dreaming. I
The
thought
DC context.
The DC, yeah, the DC context is
pie
something
chart
that
with the DC
Right.
context.
maybe it was in the video that it was. I don't think it's in the PowerPoint, but I thought so I really like that. I love
probably
that.
did multiple times. We're going to do that, Sally. So there's multiple opportunities in the structure. One is what I'm finding is many states are right now, what we've pushed is a box called DC context. So it gives them, you know, ideas, because you only know so much, but giving me more ideas is going to be really helpful, that connect back to that set of standards. And then I know what you heard. In the core ideas, we're talking about having like DC economics, DC history, DC civics, and having a strand in each, or just, you know, or having that DC context piece, but at least having DC in some of the core ideas, so kids have opportunities to engage with it all the time rather than just in a 1 or 2 courses.
Right.
Yep, that's what it was.
Right. That's good. And I had one last quick question. You were involved with the New Jersey standards. Is that what you said? So New Jersey standards has a really strong statement about global education in there. Sort of, were you involved in that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
So
we
do
worked
you feel
together.
like they did a good job of.
I feel like they did, but they also like they have another kind of global context piece that they were working on. But we really tried to, when I was working with their coordinator, really tried to have that as a lens. I think it's a good set. They tried to. I still think it's a little Western, so I don't know if it's as global as I would have liked it. But their statutes are a little different, so we were kind of restrained by some. But I think they tried to do as best as they could with that. Yeah, I think they did. It seems to be more of the conversation. The department that I came from, their global studies and world studies consultant that I worked with in Wisconsin, he was amazing. I loved him. So I have like a heart for global studies, and I taught global studies. So I'm really excited about it.
Going back on that. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
And Jessica, I may contact you separately because I think I have some students that want to testify at your next public board meeting on anti-Asia hate on that topic. If that
excellent. Please do reach out, Sally. One of our board members as well, Alistair Chang, who's on the Education Standards Committee. His main project focus at the moment is literacy, but he and I are working together to talk about pulling together an ethnic studies panel, sort of separate and apart from one of our public meetings, to talk about like how that's been implemented in other places and how that relates to conversations we're having about anti-Asian hate, all sorts of inclusivity, and how we sort of build a base for that. So definitely reach out so we can talk testimony, but also connecting.
I'm very interested. Well, I would have called that area studies. Anyway, we sort of pushed for these things in the old days. So,
yeah, no, it's been there.
Old is new again, Sally.
It is true. Jessica, if you do put a panel together, I wonder if you ask the writing team to kind of watch it or listen to it. I think that would be really powerful for them.
Those are all really good ideas.
Okay, great. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Nice to see you, Annette, too.
Nice to see you. Yes, I'm just like lurking in the background of all these things.
Yeah, you're visible, so thanks.
An excellent lurker.
Yes,
Oh,
she is.
yes.
One of
I
my,
know
one of my
gotta-
favorites.
we just got to figure out how to, all this talk of implementation. I was like, what's it going to take for OSSI to be able to hire a social studies person that can actually?
Well, we should talk about that too, because, I am always hot on the button to register to council budget testimony. So I've got my budget testimony draft to come in, and
Yeah.
I'm very excited.
All this momentum we're building with the new standards, I think, makes a great case for needing that position funded at OSSI for someone that can really, mobilize the implementation across the city. So
Me too. So let's talk about that, because I think, as we talk about how much OSSI has grown as an SEA. So Beth, I don't know if you know this, but like Annette and I met 11 years ago when we were both education pioneers, and Annette was at the DC Public Charter School Board, and I was at OSSI.
Yes. Yes.
And the evolution over the last 11 years, which Annette has seen most of from the inside, has been
right. Yep. I went right back to came back back to DC after I finished law school. I've been at OSSI almost 10 years now.
So the evolution of the agency is enormous, but as you all continue to grow as an SEA, all these SEAs that have existed for 100 years.
100 years, yeah. We're not a baby anymore, but we're a toddler state.
Yeah, but toddler stage, you know how that is.
Trying to,
enormous growth in capacity that happens for toddlers. So I am all for helping us continue to build it.
Yes, we've come so far. I literally was just telling some of my colleagues today who are newer to OSSI, they were complaining about something. I was like, you guys, you have no idea like how much better OSSI is at like these things and how far we've come. And it is, try to give a few examples and they're like.
Exactly. So I think hiring a social studies content person is exactly the right next move for this.
Yeah, and it's what every other official state agency has out there.
No, not everyone does. New Mexico doesn't have one. No, not everyone has one.
Oh, Nebraska doesn't have one?
Oh, New Mexico does not have one. Nebraska has a new one. They just, somebody retired.
Let's say the majority of
yes, we'll say majority.
Some have too, elementary, secondary, and
yeah. I mean, I remember when I first
math person now. We've had a math person for a year after it being vacant. 8 of the last 9 years before that. So
I used to go to the social, I still do go to the social studies meetings of all the social studies coordinators. And so when I was at Wisconsin, I'm by myself, and like Texas would come with 7 people. This is their social studies team. And I'm like, but nobody's like that anymore.
People like Scott Abbott, who are like the de facto state specialists, because they go to the state, all the state convenings,
and
they take that upon themselves. And he does a lot of good outreach to the charters. He's not
that's good
thinking inside his DCBS box. I always joke with Scott, I'm like, you're like OSSI's social studies expert just without the title.
Right. Well, Beth and I know each other from way back in the We the People days. And so one thing I always think about is, as we talk about DC statehood and we talk about comparable sized places, I think of Wyoming. Right.
Yeah.
And I think about the fact that, Wyoming, as small as it is in terms of population and as dispersed as it is in terms of where people live within this large state with a small population, there are like identifiable people in the social studies. I met their state superintendent 2 years ago at a conference. And I said, I know this is such a strange thing to ask because Wyoming's a big place, but like, what are the chances that you know Dick Keene? Just like, I know.
Who doesn't know Dick Keene? Jeez, I know.
Dick Keene,
especially there.
But he's the social studies guy, right? He did We the People. He was state director for a while. And I think that we have a nascent sense of that in DC, and having a state level person who could begin to formalize and coordinate all those people who are like the long time social studies folks in the state,
especially now.
Yeah, and I feel like I sound silly when I say it, but like, we're the nation's capital. My goodness,
right.
Thank you.
Hey, I'll get an amen to that.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much. We'll make sure we put folks again tomorrow on the feedback, and I will pop in for the first hour on Wednesday.
All right. Thank you all. Thanks, Alex, for setting us up. All right.
Bye.
Bye.